Welcome to the History of Britain. I'm Tom Macan, I'm one of the Viking Historian cadre, and I'm sorry that this isn't the Star Theatre. I'm actually talking to you from my home in Cumbria in the English Lake District. I would normally have introduced myself at the captain's cocktail party, so I'll simply tell you now that I was a diplomat for almost 40 years. I work out I did 8 jobs in 6 countries across 3 continents. And towards the end of my career, I was the British Ambassador to Lithuania, the Deputy High Commissioner to India, and Governor of the British Virgin Islands. Now, diplomats come with a warning label. Sir Henry Wotton was a distinguished diplomat in the age of the first Queen Elizabeth, and he observed that an ambassador is an honest man who is sent abroad to lie for his country. Well, tonight you're going to get it straight down the line. So let's get going. What I'm aiming to do this evening is to introduce some of the key events and some interesting characters over 4,500 years of British history. And I hope that 4 themes are going to run through my talk. First is the growth and evolution over time of one United Kingdom. Then there's the question of constitutional change, how the country changed from an absolute monarchy to the parliamentary democracy of today. Third is the question of relationships with Europe, topical at the moment, but have always been a factor. And fourthly, just how and why did a small offshore group of European islands acquire and relinquish such a huge empire? This talk is very relevant to England's Scenic Shores cruises, which started in May for vaccinated UK guests, and also to the Round the British Isles and Midnight Sun and Northern Lights cruises, which are coming later. But let's begin with the geography, which you have now up on the screen. There's a lot of confusion on both sides of the Atlantic between England, Great Britain, United Kingdom. Sure, English is the common language, but we're not all English. And even the index of the US Library of Congress gets it wrong. So let's start with England, the round circle in the middle of my Venn diagram. England, a kingdom from the 10th century. Wales, just to the west of England, a principality in 1228, conquered by England's King Edward I, who generously made his son Prince of Wales, and that's why the eldest son of the sovereign is the Prince of Wales to this day. Scotland, further north, a kingdom from the 10th century. Until in the year 1707, England and Scotland merged to become the Kingdom of Great Britain. Great, I hear you ask. Well, great only in the sense that it was rather bigger than the other Britain, or as we would say in English, Brittany. And then in 1800, Ireland became part of the kingdom. So we now have the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. But only for 123 years, because in 1923, the 26 southern counties of Ireland voted for independence and became the Irish Free State, later the Republic of Ireland. The 6 counties of Northern Ireland voted to stay part of the United Kingdom, which is where we are today, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Why does all this matter, I hear you say? Well, first of all, the Scots, the Irish, the Welsh are not English, and they don't like being taken for English. Each has its own history and its own language. The Republic of Ireland has, as I said, been independent for 98 years. Scotland has its own legal system, its own church. The Church of England, Church of Scotland, quite different. And finally, there's a question of devolution, which we come to at the end of this talk. So let's look now at the timeline of key dates for this story. You see, we have at the beginning, Stonehenge, the first record we have of anything of substance, the legacy of the early, and we talk about the legacy of the early inhabitants. 43 AD, the year of the Roman invasion. And here for the first time, England gets a structured system of governance. 793, generally seen as the beginning of the Viking Age, the sacking of the monastery of Lindisfarne on the coast of Northumbria. 1066, the Norman invasion, the most crucial date in English history. England changed forever. 1215, Magna Carta, limiting the royal powers of royalty, codifying the rights of the people, or some of the people. 1534, Henry VIII's break with Rome, the emergence of the Church of England. 1649, the Commonwealth, Parliament has become supreme. 1815, Waterloo, the final victory over Napoleon, British triumph in Europe, 100 years of sort of peace. 1914, World War I. The empire survives, but at a cost. 1973, the United Kingdom joins the European Economic Community, the European Union. Had the UK found a new role in Europe? Well, missing off the end of this timeline is 2016, when in a referendum, the UK decided that it didn't have a role in Europe, after all. So let's start with the early history. 3,500 years of invasion and settlement. By the end of the period, we can see the shape of the nations of today's United Kingdom. Let's look at three structures from the Stone Age. Stonehenge, very familiar to many of you, as a British icon as the Tower of London. Two other locations, another stone ring in Broga and Orkney, and the Skara Brae Stone Age village. These tell us three things about the stone and Bronze Age societies. First, that they were sufficiently organized to undertake the huge tasks like building stone circles. And you've got to imagine every one of those stones weighing several tons, tens of tons, is moved by hand. Secondly, they could spare manpower from the basic tasks of keeping warm, dry, and fed for these endeavors. And third, they lived, as we can see at Skara Brae, in villages of surprisingly complex construction. And if you think those stone boxes in the middle of that image are kitchen shelves, that's just what they are. Now we're going to jump forward 2,500 years to the arrival of the Romans. It was in 54-5 BC that Julius Caesar came, saw, conquered, but AD 43 saw the first full-scale invasion, and in AD 122, the Emperor Hadrian defined the northern limit of the Roman Empire with the wall which bears his name. It's a most extraordinary construction. 75 miles from North Sea to Irish Sea, the largest surviving archaeological feature in the world. It was there to control traffic in and out of Roman-ruled territory, and it did so from mile castles. That's a mile castle in the image, spaced at every mile, with bigger garrison forces about every 5 miles. AD 410, the Romans left. Their empire was collapsing. What was their legacy in England? Well, for the first time, we have written accounts about the people and the country. There was a system of government based on London and York. They built elegantly constructed and decorated buildings, like the picture on the right, the Roman palace at Fishbourne. They left a network of constructed roads, and they had developed hot air central heating, the hypocaust. and it would be another 1400 years before the Brits learned how to build proper roads and to heat our houses properly. The collapse of the Roman administration was cataclysmic. There was a descent in Britain into warring tribes. But can we have the next slide, please? Here, thank you. In the far west of Ireland, Celtic monks kept the Christian faith alive. Leaders such as Columba and Patrick would in due course bring Christianity back to Britain and on into Europe. And their legacy can be seen in manuscripts like the Book of Kells at Trinity College, Dublin. Angles, Saxons, Jutes, European invaders, all of them, added to the havoc. But they also brought astonishing skills with precious metals, like this gold brooch that we see on the right, found in a burial site in England. And at the end of the 8th century, more invaders, the frightening Northmen or Vikings, were busy looting monasteries. And this is essentially the start of the Viking era. But why the Viking era matters is because the Viking aggression was the anvil on which the English nation was forged. But that English nation was put to the test in 1066 and found wanting. Because in January 1066, the king died and 3 men were in dispute over the English throne. By the year end, 2 of them were dead, and Duke William of Normandy, William the Conqueror, whose seal we see on the top right-hand side of the screen, had defeated the Saxon King Harold at the Battle of Hastings. And this part of history is beautifully illustrated in the Bayeux Tapestry, key sections of which, as many of you will know, are displayed in the stairwells of all the Viking ocean ships. This Norman conquest really did change everything. First of all, the feudal system. Land was now granted and sometimes taken back by the king. It was not held as of right. There was a new aristocracy. The Norman nobility took complete control of England. Saxon governmental systems were eradicated. Rebellion was crushed ruthlessly. The best known is the harrying of the North. Over 2 years, one Anglo-Saxon chronicler calculated the slaughter at over 100,000 people, and then remarked as a sort of aside, God will punish him. New architecture, like the Tower of London, a new set of records, which we come to in a moment, but also we're now at the bridge to a new era. We're now into post-conquest medieval England, a quite different place. It's a united country. There is strong central control. There is direct involvement in Europe. Duke William from Normandy had possessions and obligations in France. And there is an aspiration to exercise control over Wales and Scotland. But the central and immediate legacy is the Domesday Book. The Domesday Book, 1086, in which all England is recorded. It's one of the greatest national inventories ever undertaken. In the UK, there was nothing comparable until the 19th century, and it had 2 purposes. The first was to identify unpaid taxes prior to the redistribution of lands following the conquest. In other words, what were people owing that the state didn't know about? And second, it gave the new Norman administration a clear picture of the country and the resources at its disposal. But what is so fascinating is that many of the places are still clearly identifiable. For example, Bosham was then a prosperous little port. It's now a modest village, popular with yachtsmen. But there you see the chancel arch, as it is today, and it's exactly the same in the Bayeux Tapestry. And why is the book called the Doomsday Book? Well, William recorded, weighed and judged everything as God will do at the last judgment, the day of doom. It was a handy reminder that kings are God's appointees and representatives on earth. With the Normans, a new architecture was born. The Norman invaders brought, we have the next slide, please. The Norman invaders brought a new, confident style of building, far eclipsing anything that England had known up to then. Castles. Here we have Carnarvon Castle. Rather later in the Norman period, it really represents the apogee of early medieval castle construction. I think it looks absolutely terrifying, and that was just what it was meant to do. The peasants were meant to be terrified by it. Cathedrals. Senior churchmen were not only important in the church, they exercised state authority. They needed new grand cathedrals. On the top right, we see Durham, 1093, perhaps the finest remnant relic of that period. And then abbeys and monasteries. Battle Abbey, you see the remains in the bottom right-hand corner, was a Norman act of penance for the invasion, one of dozens linked to European monastic orders, Augustinians, Cistercians, Premonstratensians, and so on. They were important centres of commerce, administration, and particularly of education. Monastery-educated men provided the backbone of the royal administration, useful since most of the kings couldn't read or write. And so it was that the 12th century chronicler, William of Malmesbury, wrote, "England has become the dominion of foreigners. No Englishman is earl, bishop, or abbot, and newcomers gnaw away at the riches of England." But in due course, the king's wings were clipped. Magna Carta comes in 1215, because even a king has got to carry his country with him, and King John spectacularly failed to do so. His sins were numerous. They included wasting taxpayers' money on an incompetently fought war in France, and getting into a row with the Pope, leading to papal interdict. And so in 1215, the barons forced his agreement to Magna Carta. First, the law is supreme, and it applies to the king and to everyone else as well. The second tier, thank you, and to everyone else as well, including to the barons. Kings and officials may no longer do as they please. Their powers are limited. Fair trial means trial by your equals, but at least by other barons, because we're not that far into democracy. Punishment must be proportionate to crime. And finally, taxation must be with the consent of the taxed. Our American viewers may well think that had a British government in the 1770s remembered that little bit about taxation and consent, it would have saved itself a great deal of trouble in North America. These key points in the Magna Carta shaped the laws of the English-speaking world down subsequent centuries. How significant are they today? Well, Lord Denning, a distinguished 20th century jurist, observed, "These are the foundation of the freedom of the individual against the arbitrary authority of the despot." But the course of history would run no smoother after Magna Carta. English history in the later medieval period is punctuated by an English conquest of Wales and a failure to conquer Scotland. By the 100 Years' War between England and France, it forged strong national identities on both sides at huge cost. And England came out of it very badly, retaining only the city of Calais as its only territory on French soil. It left with a strong sense that European conflicts should be avoided. But there was no avoiding the Black Death. the global pandemic of bubonic plague, which devastated Europe between 1348 and 1350. So you see, global pandemics are really nothing new. But this one killed about half the population of England, of 6 million. The economic impact was enormous. There was no one there to till the fields. Rental values plummeted. Government attempted to impose wage restraint, leading in 1381 to the Peasants' Revolt on the right-hand side. The men of Kent marched on London. The 14-year-old King Richard, you see there with the blue cape, is busy diffusing the immediate crisis, talking to the crowd, while the leader, Wat Tyler, is being quietly dispatched by the barons on the left-hand side of the picture. But it's historically significant for 3 reasons. Well, obviously, the Black Death was a public health disaster, but it's also important politically and economically. It was the first manifestation of people power, a grassroots rebellion against the ruling classes. And it was also the first step towards a wage-based rural economy and the abolition of serfdom, which was a form of slavery. Meanwhile, bigger changes were happening on the European mainland. I've called this section Reformation to Union, because in the 15th century, 3 crucial developments took place on the continent. First was the spread of knowledge. Johannes Gutenberg invented the printing press. That was the internet revolution of its day. No longer was one reliant on hand copying of everything. New ideas. The Renaissance in Italy was challenging received wisdom and dogma. And religion. Martin Luther was proposing a radical new theology in Germany. All these changes impacted on England, as on the rest of Europe, but the result here was a bit different. Henry VIII, best known perhaps for having 6 wives, but actually he has a lot more to answer for. His dynasty's claim to the throne was shaky. A male heir was crucial, and sadly his first wife, the Spanish Catherine of Aragon, had failed to produce one. So he wanted a new wife. The Pope refused to annul his first marriage, and to cut a very long story short, Henry took matters into his own hands. He declared that the Church of England was independent of Rome and that he, Henry, was head of it. Pretty simple, really. At the same time, he abolished the abbeys and monasteries for 2 reasons. The first was that he'd broken one link with Europe, the direct link to Rome. He certainly didn't want the monasteries taking instructions from their European-wide orders. He wanted religion to be English and nothing else. And secondly, Henry was always short of cash. Expropriating monastic wealth was a quick way of solving his immediate financial problems. And across the country, ruins like these that we see here of the Cistercian Abbey at Ribot are mute testimony to this lost heritage. And while across Europe, and indeed in Scotland, the Protestant Revolution was theologically driven, in England it was a naked power grab by a man who thought Luther's teaching actually very dangerous. So this marks a very clear swing away from Europe. And Henry's legacy was to bring yet more turbulence. It was followed by a roller coaster. 6 years of militant Protestantism under King Edward VI, 5 years of equally militant Catholicism under Queen Mary, 11 turbulent years of persecution and burning of heretics by both monarchs, until Queen Elizabeth came to the throne. She restored a degree of harmony, and she ruled for 45 years. Sought by many, she never married, hence the sobriquet, the Virgin Queen. Marrying one risks upsetting the others was her rule, and it worked. The apogee of the efforts to replace her with a Catholic monarch was the magnificent armada of Philip II of Spain in 1588. Elizabeth's appearance on horseback before her forces assembled at Tilbury was a triumph. "I know," she said, "I have the body but of a weak and feeble woman, but I've the heart and stomach of a King of England too." And this so boosted the morale of her naval forces that they went out and did for the Spanish Armada. Actually, it was really the fire ships and stormy weather that did most damage as much as naval tactics. And British historians tend to gloss over the return match a year later, when an English armada met with a complete disaster at Spanish hands. But England remained free from European domination. And at the same time, arts, literature, and music were to flourish. Shakespeare, the language of Shakespeare. The 16th, 17th centuries all see the finest flowering of the English language as we know it today. And of course, those presses, printing presses invented by Gutenberg, ensured that many more could read it. On the bottom right, the Geneva or Breeches Bible is in modern English. It's perfectly readable. The spelling, the punctuation is a bit odd for us, but the meaning is clear. And this was the Bible of Shakespeare, Cromwell, Donne, Bunyan. Why is it called the Breeches Bible? Well, you may recall in Genesis that Adam and Eve realized they're naked and they stitch leaves together. The translator was really bothered about what he should call the result, and he decided that these garments should be called breeches or trousers. William Shakespeare, the dominant literary figure of the age, 37 plays, 154 sonnets, and more. Those plays, written for a small repertory theatre, you see the reproduction here, are now performed and read more often and in more countries than ever. So his great contemporary, the poet and dramatist Ben Jonson, sums it up. He was not for an age, but for all time. Shakespeare's works, the Geneva and the King James authorized version of the Bible, are truly the foundation of the language we all speak today. No other sources have had greater influence. But meanwhile, back in the tough old world of politics, we come to the Civil War. Well, not immediately, because on Elizabeth's death, the throne passed to the Scottish royal house of Stuart by descent from Henry VII. England and Scotland are now two countries with one king. Charles II, centre stage here, the second Stuart king, was not prepared to cooperate with Parliament. Civil war ensued. Charles lost the war, the throne, and his head. Other British reigns have been cut short, but public execution, I have to say, is unique. And this led to the Commonwealth, parliamentary rule with no monarch, but someone called the Lord Protector, Oliver Cromwell, whose statue stands outside Parliament today. Parliament had become all-powerful, and its greatest legacy is undoubtedly the Act of Habeas Corpus of 1640, which makes clear that imprisonment is a decision for the courts and not for government. But Cromwell was a man in a hurry. He was frustrated by Parliament's deliberations. In 1653, he dissolved it in an emotional outburst, and essentially he ruled monarchically, supported by a hand-picked Council of State for the last 4 years of his life. The Civil War was the bloodiest conflict in the history of the British Isles. It's reckoned about 200,000 people, 2.5% of the population, perished. And to what purpose? 11 years after Charles I's execution and the Commonwealth experiment abandoned, his son, Charles II, was back on the throne. Which will bring us very soon to the last and final revolution, but not quite. Because during Charles II's reign, disaster struck twice. 1665, another pandemic, the Great Plague, devastated the country. And in 1666, the Great Fire of London destroyed 4/5 of the capital. The start of the fire is marked by the monument, and the city was, of course, in great measure rebuilt by Sir Christopher Wren. Charles is known as the Merry Monarch. He released the nation from its Puritan straitjacket. But when his successor, James II, seemed to threaten a return to Catholic ways, Parliament was not risking it. It chose Mary, James I's elder daughter, with her husband, the Dutch Prince William of Orange, as joint monarchs, Protestants both of them. Interesting, because Parliament is now demonstrating its primacy over the Crown. The Crown isn't doing its stuff, Parliament selects somebody else. This is known as the Glorious Revolution by English historians because it was free of bloodshed. It has to be said the Scots and the Irish don't quite see it that way. William's victory at the Battle of the Boyne, the central picture here, left unresolved that conflict which is still alive in Ireland today. But this reign saw a flurry of reformist legislation, including in 1689 the Bill of Rights. This set parliamentary constraints on government power, something we're still arguing about in the United Kingdom today, and established the rights of the individual. It was one of the models for the US Bill of Rights of 1789 and the UN Declaration of Human Rights of 1948. Which brings us to the next great constitutional change, the Acts of Union. For 104 years, England and Scotland had shared a monarch. In 1707, we finally see the creation of Great Britain. We have a new Union flag, England's Red Cross of St. George, superimposed on Scotland's blue saltire cross. We have a new royal coat of arms, in which the 3 gold lions of England enjoy equal status with the single red lion of Scotland. And we have the Articles of Union, adopted simultaneously by the English and Scottish parliaments, leading to the latter's extinction for 192 years. The immediate cause of this union was a disastrous Scottish imperial experiment at Darien in Central America. It was touted as the investment opportunity of the century. 1/4 of Scotland's GDP was invested in it. The colony was a complete failure, the country was ruined, and union with larger and wealthier England was the only way out. And perhaps ironically, Scots would go on to play a leading role in the development of what is now the British, not English, Empire. It's also worth noting that exactly 300 years ago this month, in 1721, was the appointment of Robert Walpole as the first Prime Minister. Control of government was slipping yet further from the King's grasp, though it was, of course, relevant that King George II spoke only German and no English. Meanwhile, the empire was developing apace. 17th, 18th centuries saw the emergence of a global British Empire. Her explorers were everywhere. James Cook went almost thrice round the globe. Henry Hudson was busy in northern Canada, as the bay reminds us. George Vancouver in the Pacific. George Bass in Australia. In the middle of the century, success in the 7 Years' War ensured British rule in Canada and over much of India. Booming China trade was in British hands. The global prospects look fantastic. The Revolutionary War in America was a rude shock. How did Britain get it so wrong? Well, the spark was, of course, the Boston Tea Party, with its cry of no taxation without representation. Britain seemed to have clean forgotten its history. What does it say in Magna Carta? What was the English Civil War all about? The 1679 Bill of Rights? They all make a specific link between taxation and the citizen. Secondly, Britain was quite unprepared and unfocused for this war. One can have sympathy with that German regiment of Hessian soldiers in North America who were due a consignment of new boots. When they opened the packing cases, they did not find new boots, they found ballet shoes, which are not much use in battle. And thirdly, Britain was fighting a war at a distance against a determined enemy which was familiar with the ground and supported by the populace. This sort of thing often ends in tears, and we can all think of more recent examples. Okay, the empire recovered its stride and expanded across the globe, but General Cornwallis's surrender and the loss of the North American colonies was a quite extraordinary reversal. So now we're coming to the Industrial Revolution and the empire. Back home, there are two very different revolutions going on, in agriculture and in industry. And these would supply the needs of the empire and draw on it for raw materials. They would turn society upside down and change the way the country would live. Agricultural production took off in the 17th and 18th centuries for two basic reasons. One was the reorganization of landholdings. No longer was land shared and farmed in common, but with the enclosures, farm units were created. Farmers now had an incentive to improve their land. And secondly, new machinery. Jethro Tull's seed drill may look a bit odd to us, but it sows seed much faster, in the right place, and less wastefully. Grain production soared, providing bread for the population working in those new industrial towns. The Industrial Revolution, partly made possible because there was enough to eat. I've just taken two examples of key developments. The production of iron in quantity and dependable quality. Abram Darby's Iron Bridge in Shropshire was a quantum leap forward, and you can still walk over it today. Transport. By 1830, George Stephenson's rocket, a reproduction on the right there, could run dependably at 17 miles an hour between Manchester and Liverpool. A mere 18 years later, you could catch a train from London to Edinburgh, which covered 400 miles in 12.5 hours, as against perhaps 5 days in a stagecoach. Britain was the first country to move into the industrial age. Prime Minister Disraeli described us as the workshop of the world. And it was the resources and the technologies generated by these developments that enabled the expansion of empire. But before we go and look at that empire, I'd like to pause and consider three military giants. Just put them in their place in history. Because British policy in the 18th and 19th centuries was essentially to preserve the balance of power in Europe. And three men deserve much of the credit. On the left, John Churchill, 1st Duke of Marlborough. One biographer analyses his unerring ability to sense an enemy's weakness and throw him off balance. His success in the War of the Austrian Succession led to the country making a gift to him of Blenheim Palace, which I'm sure some of you have visited, and which I think Karen Hagen is going to be talking at this time tomorrow. In the centre, the Duke of Wellington, the Iron Duke, won his spurs in the Peninsular War, chasing the forces of Napoleon out of Portugal and Spain, and cemented victory over Napoleon at Waterloo. A man who had as much skill blending the military with the political, and a strategist as fine a strategist as a tactician. And then on the right, Vice Admiral Horatio Lord Nelson. His victory at the Battle of Trafalgar established British maritime supremacy for well over a century, and Nelson's navy would provide the force projection for growth and defence of the empire. HMS Victory is, of course, preserved at Portsmouth and is visited on a number of our shore excursions. So you see, this kept Britain out of any direct involvement in the running of Europe. It just ensured that nobody else was running it while we weren't. And this really brings us to the Victorian era. Queen Victoria's 64 reign saw what had now become, since 1800, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland as the world's global power. The Queen avoided personal scandal and the sort of controversies that had dogged her predecessors. Her children married across the royal houses of Europe. Here you see only 5 of them, there were more to come. The institution of monarchy became revered and respected. And it was a period of immense change in the United Kingdom. We became the world's largest manufacturer and exporter. By the end of the century, most of the male population had become enfranchised. We had a new style of architecture known across the world as Victorian. The Great Exhibition of 1851, a celebration of manufacturing, became the model for expos across the world, and they still happen. There were advances in science, medicine, engineering, policing, education across the board. The population more than doubled from 14 to 38 million. Life expectancy went up 10 years from 40 to 50. But Victoria was not only queen, but by now empress, because we have reached the apogee of empire. Wonderful map of 1886, and there were more red bits still to be marked on it in the final years of the century. Across the UK, across the globe, the UK ruled what Lord Salisbury described as the empire on which the sun never sets. To which it is said that Abraham Lincoln commented, "There is a good reason that the sun never sets on the British Empire, and that is because the Almighty does not trust the British in the dark." Well, here we see the bottom centre, triumphant Britannia, presiding over her globe-encircling empire. We see individuals from the empire story over on the left, the soldier, the sailor, the administrator. On the right, we see the native peoples, examples of fauna and flora. In black, we see marked the crucial sea routes which bound the empire together. Above all, you can see the importance of the Suez Canal, the route to India, and the canal was run and owned by France until 1956. This confidence in the empire is reflected in its music. Land of Hope and Glory, 1902 words, "Wider, still and wider, shall thy bounds be spread. God, who made thee mighty, make thee mightier yet." But as the 19th century turned into the 20th, we come into the modern era. Everything in the garden seemed rosy. But this idyll was to be shattered in 1914 when war broke out. But for those who would see, the cracks were already emerging. And let's look at how those cracks widened into chasm. The Battle of Biddlesburg in the Boer War. The Boer War was the canary in the coal mine. Imperial forces across the empire had had previous reverses, what Brits call the Indian Mutiny, and the Indians more accurately call the First Indian Revolution, the Siege of Khartoum, but the imperial forces had always quickly re-established control. In South Africa, they faced well-organized opponents. The regular army was insufficient. An extensive UK volunteer force had to be recruited. Victory took 3 years. Dublin's Easter Rising in the middle of the First World War was suppressed in 6 days, but at the cost of almost 500 lives, over half of them civilians. This led directly to the nationalists winning almost 3/4 of the seats in the 1918 general election. Independence for the southern 26 counties followed in 1923. Part of the empire very close to home had broken away. And then the Indian independence movement, which took off at the end of World War I under the leadership of Mahatma Gandhi, who we see here in 1930 leading the 250-mile Salt March, protesting about the government's monopoly and tax on salt, which bore very hard on the poor. Mass peaceful protest the imperial authorities found very difficult to deal with, and independence would follow only 17 years later. And so by 2021, the empire has been reduced to a dozen or so small islands, like the one which I used to govern. And then we have those 2 world wars and their devastating impact on the United Kingdom. They impacted on us uniquely. UK was involved from start to finish. At times, it was almost alone. It was never invaded. And there is a tendency to see both as British victories, overlooking essential Allied inputs. For the UK, the First World War lasted from July 1914 to November 1918, whereas US involvement is from April 1917. The main theatre was the Western Front, dominated by trench warfare, with the hideous destruction portrayed by war artists like Paul Nash, bottom left. Over 5 million, that's 1 in 4 adult males, served in the British Armed Forces. About 800,000, 16%, perished. The equivalent US figures are 4.3 million served, 116 died, 2.6%. Memorials to this slaughter still bear silent witness in every town and village across the country. World War II's aspect was quite different. The number of military losses was half, 380,000. Cities were in the front line, 67,000 civilians killed. And St. Paul's Cathedral in the Blitz became the icon of London's resistance, but other cities also suffered badly: Portsmouth, Liverpool, Coventry. The tide was to turn in June 1944 with D-Day, the largest invasion fleet in history, over 500 ships, 130,000 soldiers. It was an Allied operation with General Eisenhower in command, and the end of the war was to come 11 months later. But by 1945, an exhausted nation that celebrated victory was hungry for change, and with the Labour Party's landslide victory in the general election of July that year, they got it. And I identify just 3 of the most radical decisions. First, India's independence. This could no longer be ducked. a new viceroy was appointed to make it happen. This was the first deliberate step in the shrinking of Britain's global empire. The National Health Service became the centerpiece of the welfare state, a national compulsory flat rate insurance scheme to combine healthcare, unemployment and retirement benefits, still going strong today. And the nationalization of key sectors, coal, electricity, gas, railways, like a photograph, canals, steel, iron and steel production, Bank of England, all taken into public ownership. Certainly this enabled a more strategic approach, but too often it seemed political intervention trumped sound economic policies. And by 1979, the consensus had shifted. Margaret Thatcher's election victory saw the majority of nationalized industries re-privatized within the decade. But I want to move on now to the year 1997, events and anniversaries. I think all of us will recall Princess Diana's death that year, and British listeners will certainly recall the election of Tony Blair's new Labour government to hold office for the next 13 years. But it was also a year of anniversaries, 100 years on from Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee. The UK had by now moved from being the global superpower to what has been described as a major power of the second rank, about which a little earlier Secretary of State Dean Acheson had remarked correctly that Great Britain has lost an empire and has not yet found a role. It was the 50th anniversary of the end of British imperial rule in India. The UK-India relationship had become one between sovereign powers, facilitated by a common language, educational links, investment, and an Indian expatriate community in the UK of well past 1 million, but complicated by suspicions about British motives, a memory of historical pressures, and the visa pressures generated by that expatriate community. And finally, 1997 was the handover of Hong Kong and its 6.7 million people to China, and is seen as many as the definitive end of empire. The handover, I think, was inevitable, given that most of Hong Kong's territory was actually on lease, which was expiring. But 24 years on, it is very clear that many issues which were thought to have been settled by the UK-China agreement have not actually been so. But back to the UK, because a year later, we saw serious devolution of power away from the centre. Devolution issues. Legislation was, we have the next one, please. 1998 legislation returned powers to Scotland and Wales and re-established devolved government in Northern Ireland in a way that was to reflect their respective history and traditions. The Northern Ireland Assembly occupies Stormont Castle, built in 1932 for the then government of Northern Ireland. The Scottish Parliament is in a smart new building in Edinburgh. The Welsh Assembly, the Senedd, has equally smart premises in Cardiff. All these assemblies and the governments reporting to them have a range of devolved powers, but they broadly cover most domestic matters like health, education, and so on. It has to be said that language is a deeply felt issue in all three of these parts of the United Kingdom. One clear aim of devolution was to bury the idea of independence. It has not done so. In 2014, Scotland held a referendum on independence, and the proposal was defeated by 54% to 46%. But in the Brexit referendum, only a couple of years later, Scotland voted strongly pro-EU, and that has revived all the arguments. And there's an argument in England too. Powers have not been devolved. So laws are now made by the Westminster Parliament, with Scots, Welsh and Northern Irish participating, but it doesn't affect them. But it's quite clear that all three communities seem increasingly confident about their nationality in a way that is still more uncertain in England. This has been seen particularly during the COVID pandemic, where health being a devolved responsibility, we have had the British Prime Minister and the three other First Ministers also taking the stage and being perceived publicly to have made a better job of things. And so we finally move to the latest twist in the UK's relationship with Europe, now more uncertain than ever. Back in 1973, the UK, along with Ireland and Denmark, joined the EEC. But the commitment to Europe was never complete on either side of the political spectrum. And this wound was to fester. In the 2014 elections for the European Parliament, the anti-EU UK Independence Party, UKIP, did well. Prime Minister David Cameron reckoned he would settle the issue once and for all by holding a referendum and winning it. He held the referendum and lost. 52% voting in favour of leaving, 48% to remain. The problem was that the voters were not asked, and so they were unable to indicate exactly what sort of relationship the UK should enjoy with its largest trading partner, with which it shares a land border in Ireland. Well, we're now 4 years on and 2 prime ministers later, and we have some degree of clarity. But there are a huge range of issues on trade which have still to be finalised. There is a real problem in Ireland where both sides have pledged not to reimpose controls on the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic, but that leaves very open as to where is the EU's external border where import and sanitary controls are exercised. No one has solved that problem yet. So in this latest phase, we see a UK government turning away from Europe, and the balance between parliamentary and referendum issues, referendum decisions, raises, to my mind, some serious constitutional issues. So now let's just quickly reconsider the ground that we have covered. We started with the Roman conquest and rule. Tribal Stone Age society was replaced by an organised system of government. We looked at how the Angles, Saxons, Celts and Vikings, 500 years of waves of invaders from Europe. And by 1000 AD, we had 4 recognisable nations. The Norman conquest, England's institutions, buildings and more were completely reshaped on a European model. In Magna Carta, we had the first major constitutional step. The king's powers were constrained. The consent of the aristocracy was required. We broke with Rome in 1534. A new Protestant maritime nation was emerging. With Cromwell and the Civil War, Parliament became the seat of power, and citizens' rights were further codified. Great Britain emerged a united kingdom in 1707. England, Wales and Scotland, one nation with one parliament. Queen Victoria and the world empire. We saw how within 2 centuries Britain had become the United Kingdom and master of a global empire, and then decline with 2 world wars and devolution, imperial overreach, the exhaustion of war, end of the empire. With devolution, the UK had become less centrally governed. And finally, a retreat from the European role, but with Which brings me to the end of this presentation. I just want to thank James and his team for setting up the lecture and manipulating the slides from afar. I look forward to meeting at least some of you once cruising restarts, starting, of course, for the cruises with UK guests with England's scenic shores starting next month. And I'm going to move on to questions, of which a number seem to have come in. Tom from the United States opened the batting, asking about the main reasons that led Britain to relinquish its vast empire. And he specifies some of them. Well, undoubtedly, by the time we got to 1945-46, policymakers had realized that there were not the resources to manage this vast empire. At the same time, you had the United Nations, where a spirit of anti-colonialism, very much in that first nation to emerge from the British Empire, the United States, very much leading this, and a lot of voices from the ex-colonies of Spain and Portugal, which have become independent in previous centuries. And I think also a human rights realization that perhaps there was no God-given reason why a mere 50 million Brits should run the affairs of 200 other folks across the board. So it's a mixture of reasons. The literature on the subject is immense. And you really have, to some extent, you can take your pick. But your last question, Tom, was, has Great Britain regretted any of these decisions? There are a number who think that the abandonment of empire was a great mistake. They're fully entitled to their opinion. I just don't happen to agree with it. René Laporte asks, says, thank you for this lecture. I'm interested, at what point in history was the country at its most powerful? I guess one could say perhaps in the 50 years following the Battle of Waterloo. Alternative power bases in Europe had effectively been eliminated, and one would only see a stronger power emerge with Imperial Germany in the 1870s. The large colonial dominion possessions were all in British control, although a measure of self-government had already been imparted. So I would say 1820 to 1870. But it only becomes clear, I think, the rot is setting in at the beginning of the 20th century with the Boer War. Noel from the US asks, does the NHS continue to incorporate health insurance, unemployment insurance and pension? And there was a heart at the bottom of the article in Union. Well, I have to say I'd missed the heart at the bottom of the article of Union. I don't know whether, James, you can flash up that slide on the screen. I can give you its number in just a moment. Says he. Not sure I can. In answer to your question, the National Health Service is actually just about the delivery of health. But we, all of us, well, everyone in employment pays what is known as national insurance, which is calculated at, I think, 9% of income, half payable by the employer, half by the employee. And that goes in part to fund it goes wholly to fund the National Health Service, unemployment benefit and pension. but in fact, national insurance payments no longer cover that. So there is money from general taxation that goes that way as well. But the National Health Service remains free at the point of delivery. All of us are entitled to a state pension when we reach pensionable age, which of course is now slowly creeping upwards. And anyone who loses their employment is entitled to unemployment benefit under a new system called universal credit. So I hope that answers your. And Noel puts a further question: will the EU stay intact? There were many on the leave side of the referendum who said that if the Brits left, the EU will fall to pieces. All the evidence is that the UK's departure has made the EU much keener to hang together. So I think the answer to that is no. Just a moment. Why is, Marianne asks, why is doomsday spelt dome and not doom? Oh, well, I think that's just English spelling, don't you? I mean, I mentioned that we might find the Breaches Bible, we might find the spelling a bit odd. I don't really think there's any more to it than that. Maggie from France asks, why are Stone Age settlements in the UK in areas known for wild and wet weather? Were they a sturdier bunch than we are today? Well, I'm sure the answer to the second question is yes. But the first part of the question is really very interesting, because it actually tells us an awful lot more about archaeology than it does where people lived. There was probably a Stone Age settlement on the banks of the River Thames where London now is. But the trouble is that successive generations have built on top and on top and on top. So the Stone Age remains have disappeared. So it's only when a monument is truly massive, like Stonehenge, or very isolated, and in the case of Skara Brae, completely covered by windblown sand, that the relics have survived. So probably there were Stone Age, Iron Age people all over the country, and archaeology is always turning up new sites, but so much has been lost because the site that was convenient for Stone Age man is pretty convenient for 20th century man and intervening generations, and they've all built on it. Jerry asks whether are the different remnants of historic ages unique to each county. Sorry, this is leaping around. Just a moment. Is there more to be seen from the Normans, Vikings, Romans, and others in, for example, Sussex and Kent? It is certainly true that there are more historical relics to be found in the agriculturally richer areas of the country, because until we got to the agricultural revolution that the industrial revolution that I talked about, that was where the wealth was. The county of Lancashire, for example, became extremely wealthy as a result of the cotton trade. Much of that cotton, of course, imported from the southern United States. Up until then, it had not been a particularly wealthy county because there isn't a great deal of agricultural land. So that, on the whole, is what we have in terms of relics. Other places, you can sometimes tell by the names. In my home county of Cumbria, we have a lot of names which are quite clearly of Viking origin. and that is evidence of considerable Viking settlement and not much outside interference with those traditions. Whether we all have more Viking blood in our veins, I don't know. Gary from Cincinnati, can I comment on why Britain has maintained dominion over the Falkland Islands? How have interests changed over the centuries? The reason that really all the existing overseas territories, of which the Falkland Islands is one, the British Virgin Islands another, remain just that and have not gone to independence is because they are too small. Bermuda will be the largest with 60,000 people, and the success rate of very small states across the world is a depressing one. I could think, for example, of the island of Nauru in the Pacific, which, having sold its sole wealth, phosphate reserves, is now distinctly impoverished. So it's very difficult to see what alternative these have. But I suspect really what Gary is asking is, why did we go to war over it? I think it's a very important principle there, that if part of your territory is attacked and you do not respond, somebody will have another go at another bit of your territory. Don't forget that this attack happened at the height of the Cold War. I was at the time the spokesman for the British Embassy in Bonn, Germany. I was acutely conscious that in the middle of East Germany, there was a Western exclave, the opposite of an enclave, in the shape of West Berlin, which essentially was militarily indefensible had the Soviet forces in East Germany decided to take it over. But because the United States, the United Kingdom and France had made it quite clear that we were going to defend Berlin with our soldiers, and if our soldiers were attacked, that was an attack on the United Kingdom and on the rest of NATO, this made the price of trying to take over Berlin too high. So that is essentially the reason that we went to war and retrieved the island from Argentine control. The economic value of these territories to the United Kingdom is zero. I mean, this is a complete reversal of the reason that we created an empire in India, but essentially we are stuck with these territories and no one is devoting much effort to define a long-term future. I thought somebody would ask this. Yes, Evelyn from Maple Grove, can I recommend further reading on British history? Well, I did put a small selection of books. For me, the most fascinating book is this one. It's called The Isles by Norman Davis. It's a big book, 1078 pages, but quite readable. If you want something more compact, you might want to consider, yes, the Oxford Popular History of Britain. But there's also quite a good reading list. If you go onto the Viking website and call up the Round the British Isles cruise, you will see some books suggested there. Now, Dominic from Kelowna asks the most important legacies from Victorian Britain, and is there much that can still be seen in Britain today in terms of architecture and engineering? Yes, absolutely. Architecture is without doubt the most visual thing, from the great Victorian cathedrals. One thinks perhaps of Truro or Liverpool Cathedral, started in the Victorian era, finished a bit later. In terms of railway construction, the steel bridge across the River Forth, just upstream from Edinburgh. I once took a family of Canadian civil engineers to see that. They were very impressed. Likewise, Brunel's bridge across the Saltash at Tamar. A further set of buildings which people sometimes overlook, town halls. Manchester Town Hall is quite the grandest building in Manchester. That's another important legacy of the Victorian era, the creation of civic government of towns and cities, where city councils really became important organs of government and a stepping stone to high office. So the answer is there is a huge amount to see. There's quite a lot which isn't so good either, but it's there. David from Orlando, did the Bill of Rights include freedom of religion? No. Freedom of religion was pretty constrained in 1689. You were expected to attend the Church of England on every Sunday. That was to come much later, and of course at that stage there was still the fear of Catholic invasion, and people had been through that mill with Edward VI and Queen Mary, and then the Civil War. They didn't want to see that repeated. Bill comments that I didn't cover scientists. No, you're quite right. Newton, Darwin, Maxwell, Turing, who were remembered centuries after Cromwell, Victoria, and Mick Jagger. Yes, I think that's true on the world scale. But in terms of the history of Britain, well, you can't cover everything in 60 minutes. And what I was trying to concentrate on was how the nation evolved. And this, on the whole, I'm afraid, is something that's undertaken by kings and politicians and generals, perhaps more than scientists. Ayla from Carmel tries to tempt me with suggestion which should be the most impressive historic sites to be on her bucket list when she visits the UK. Now, I really don't think I can be drawn on that. I think you have to buy the guidebook. You can stick to the DK top 10. What I would say is that really in almost any part of the country, you can find a building, a site which is of interest. Alfred from Cambridge in the UK, if I was to pick one notable figure from history that had the most influence on shaping the nation as it is today, I think that has to be William the Conqueror. I really do. So much changed after the Norman invasion. The language, it's estimated that something between a half and 2/3 of English language today incorporates words which came in from the Norman French. Governance, if one's going to be unkind, government had been pretty informal under the Anglo-Saxon kings. It was the Normans who made this an organized country. So everybody says that 1066 is the one date that Brits remember in their history. I think they're right to do so. Alan Timothy from New York asked, how do they trace my lineage back to the Vikings when I developed Lou Gehrig disease? I don't know, obviously, but I would think probably through DNA. And that's something that I find particularly interesting in terms of Viking heresy, Viking history. A fascinating new book has been published very recently. It's called The River Kings, and it's all about the Vikings in Eastern Europe. Readily available on Amazon, The River Kings. But the author is a bioarchaeologist, which means that when she digs up some bones, what she's really interested in is the DNA and decayed isotopes like strontium-90, and I don't know quite what else. Because in the last 20 years, science has made such huge advances that you can really tell an awful lot from the constituents, the analysis of bones. So I guess, Alan, that was, they compared your DNA and other elements to Viking bones, and that's why they told you were a Viking. Right, Regina from Los Angeles. Can I comment on the relationship between Fielding and the composer Handel? No, I can't, I'm afraid. Outside my field. Isn't the work of Shakespeare more important than wars? Yes, in terms of human value, infinitely more important. But this tale I've been trying to tell is how a nation emerged. And I think I gave Shakespeare credit for the creation of the English language, which is probably the United Kingdom's greatest gift to the world. So yes, more important, but there were reasons he didn't get that much space. Now I think a number of you have been very kind and said thank you. Just a moment. Yes, I think that unless anybody's I'm sorry, Dick, I have missed you out. Dick asks how England got partitioned into areas such as Sussex. That's very easy. The county of Sussex was the South Saxons, like the county of Essex was the East Saxons, and the county of Wessex was the West Saxons, and the county of Middlesex, which no longer exists, only the Brits could have a county called Middlesex. Those were the Middle Saxons. Likewise, the area we know as East Anglia was where the East Angles lived, and Suffolk was the North folk in East Anglia, and Suffolk the South folk. So in terms of the Angles and the Saxons, that's really quite easy. Some of the other names go back much earlier. My county of Cumbria comes from the Gaelic word Cymru, which is the name for Wales. That means us, we, as distinct from you lot, the rest of you out there, we alone. So in most cases of most counties, you can trace the historical reason and some of them are simply geography. Oxford, the county of Oxfordshire, takes its name from the city of Oxford, where there was a ford, a river crossing. We've done freedom of religion. Yes, I really think that is everything. So, no, I'm sorry. Robert from Mission Viejo asks, what role does England play in the Commonwealth today? Yes, I once had responsibility in the Foreign Office for running Commonwealth affairs, and what I was trying to point out frequently was that it is no longer called the Commonwealth, it's no longer called the British Commonwealth, it is the Commonwealth of Nations. Britain is the largest country economically by far, the largest contributor, and the Queen has been the head of the Commonwealth, and it is agreed that after her time, when Prince Charles becomes the king in the United Kingdom, he will take over this role as head of the Commonwealth. Personally, I think we have not made as good use as we should have done of the Commonwealth. I think we have been stingy in the resources we have put into it. And while obviously the relationship with Europe is going to be absolutely central, because that's where our defence interests lie, certainly for the moment, and that's where the vast greater part of our trade is done, that we should be devoting more effort to the Commonwealth, but ministers don't seem to find it very easy to find the time. And the result is that our influence has without doubt diminished. Right, I think that really is it. So thank you everybody very much for joining me this evening. As I said before, I look forward to meeting you all shipboard in times to come. I just hope that you won't have to put up with listening to me give this lecture again. Thank you all very much. Goodbye or good night, depending where you are.